On a quiet February morning in 2005, first responders in Atmore, Alabama arrived at a small home after a desperate 911 call. Inside, they found a scene that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. 6-month-old Elias Ocean Johnson lay motionless in his crib, bruised, bleeding, and unresponsive. It didn't take long for police to realize this was no accident. Elias had been suffocated and beaten, murdered by his own father. The killer was Christopher Thomas Johnson, a 39-year-old man who, in his own words, said he did it because he hated his wife and wanted to get back at her. He confessed that morning, showing no emotion, no regret, only hatred. When investigators questioned him, he said, "I didn't want to kill her, so I killed what she loved most." The brutality shocked even seasoned detectives. Autopsy results revealed Elias had been beaten so severely that he suffered over 50 injuries, including broken ribs and internal bleeding. At trial, Johnson represented himself defiant, cold, and unrepentant. The jury took just 2 hours to sentence him to death. This is the story of Christopher Johnson, a father who turned his own child into a weapon of revenge, and the execution that followed 6 years later. Classification: murderer. Characteristics: parasite, hated his wife. Number of victims: 1. Date of murder, February 18, 2005. Date of arrest: same day. Date of birth, December 26, 1972. Victim profile: his 6-month-old son, Elias Ocean Johnson. Method of murder: suffocation. Location: Escambia County, Alabama, USA. Status: executed by lethal injection in Alabama on October 20, 2011. At trial, Johnson testified that he killed his son because he hated his wife, did not want to be near her, and did not want to worry about his wife's threats of putting him in jail for alimony or child support. After several unsuccessful attempts in the early morning hours, he laid on top of 2-month-old Elias, covered his mouth with his hand for extended periods of time, and forced his fingers into the child's mouth and down his throat to stop the crying. He also struck the child with his hand. Johnson stated he tried to quiet the child while his wife slept. When the child's mother awoke, Elias was unresponsive and cold to the touch. The forensic pathologist testified during the trial that the infant suffered at least 85 separate injuries. Suffocation and head trauma were cited as the causes of death. Johnson represented himself during part of the trial. After he was sentenced to death, he refused to pursue appeals in his case. Christopher Thomas Johnson executed by lethal injection, October 20, 2011. Holman Prison, Atmore, Alabama. Christopher Thomas Johnson, a man sentenced to die for the killing of his infant son, was pronounced dead at 6:55 p.m. Thursday at Holman Correctional Facility after being executed by lethal injection. Shortly after 6 p.m., just as the proceedings had begun, Johnson was asked if he had any last words. He simply said, "Game over." Holman chaplain Chris Summers and other prison officials looked on from inside the execution chamber. Johnson, 38, was convicted of killing his 6-month-old son, Elias Ocean Johnson, at the family's home in Atmore in February 2005. He has been on death row at Holman Prison since February of 2000. One family member was present as a witness, Johnson's brother, Thomas Eugene Lagos, who had spent the day visiting the condemned man in a cell near the execution chamber. In the small room for witnesses, Lagos sat on the front row, peering through the glass at Johnson's body in a sheet, who was strapped to a gurney on his back with his arms out to the sides. Johnson's left hand closest to the window made a sign with his index finger and little finger extended. Brian Corbett, a spokesman for the Alabama Department of Corrections who was in the witness room, later said that he had seen other inmates make that sign during executions. Corbett believed it was a symbol for "I love you." At one point, Lagos leaned toward the glass as if to touch it, flashing that same sign. After the lethal injection drugs appeared to flow through 3 tubes from an opening in the wall, Johnson's left hand relaxed and his fingers lay flat. When his body twitched, Lagos said, "Cardiac arrest," although Corbett later said that Lagos was not accurate in his description of the medical event. In the witness room, where there also were 5 news reporters, Lagos suddenly said, "It's a hard thing to watch. A lot of questions are in a lot of minds." "He paid his price," he went on. "He's been waiting on this a while. You can speak now. He's done." When a reporter began to ask Lagos a question, Corbett explained that Lagos could agree to be interviewed after the execution was finished and outside of the prison area. During the execution was not the appropriate time, Corbett said. There was no more direct interaction between Lagos and the reporters. When the curtains were drawn closed again, the room was silent for several minutes as witnesses waited for the guards to escort them out. Lagos, hands on his knees, leaned down, shook his head, and sighed. As Corbett later pointed out, the crime's victim, infant Elias, had also been Lagos's nephew. During his trial, Johnson testified that he hit and suffocated his son because he hated his wife and didn't want to be near her. He said in his testimony that he didn't want to worry about his wife's threats of putting him in jail for alimony or child support. The child was found unresponsive on a couch where Christopher Johnson had fallen asleep. According to court records, Johnson told Atmore police that he earlier had tried to get the baby to stop crying by placing his hand over Elias's mouth and by sticking his fingers down the child's throat. Prosecutors presented medical testimony that the baby had numerous injuries and had suffered 3 hard blows to his forehead. Johnson represented himself during the part of the trial. After he was sentenced to death, he refused to pursue appeals in his case and filed court papers in May, saying he didn't want anyone to go to court on his behalf. For breakfast Thursday, his final day, Johnson had eggs, grits, and biscuits, then skipped lunch in lieu of a Thursday dinner. From food available in the prison cafeteria said, Corbett Johnson chose for his final meal a turkey bologna sandwich with tomatoes and cheese french fries and an orange drink. In a holding cell near the execution chamber, Johnson had extended visiting hours for the day, joined by Lagos, according to Corbett. From a vending machine in the area, said Corbett Johnson got a Reese's Cup pretzels and grape Sunkist drink. Since 2002, when lethal injection replaced electrocution as the mode of execution in Alabama, said Corbett, 30 inmates have been executed in that manner. Johnson became the 31st. Prior to Johnson, there had been 5 executions at Holman in 2011, said Corbett. Man executed for killing son. Akati 21 David. Atmore. An Alabama man who testified that he killed his infant son at his family's home because he hated his wife was executed at a prison in the same community Thursday, declaring as his only last words, "Game over." Christopher T. Johnson, 38, was administered a lethal injection and pronounced dead at 6:05 p.m. CDT Thursday at Holman Prison in Atmore, authorities said. Johnson had filed court papers in May, saying he didn't want anyone to try to block the execution, and authorities said he had made no 11th-hour attempt to stop it. Johnson, who represented himself during part of his trial, was convicted in the February 2005 beating and suffocation death of his 6-month-old son, Elias Ocean Johnson. He testified at trial that he hated his wife, the child's mother, and didn't want to be near her. He also testified that he didn't want to worry about his wife's threats of putting him in jail for alimony or child support. The mother of the slain child, Dana Johnson, now lives in Arizona and didn't attend the execution. At the prison, Johnson was strapped on a hospital-style gurney before the lethal drugs were administered. His brother, Thomas Eugene Lagos, sat in the front row in the witness room, and the two briefly flashed hand signals to each other. When the warden asked whether he had any last words, Johnson responded, "Game over." Johnson was seen speaking briefly to a corrections officer before closing eyes and appearing to lose consciousness as the drugs began flowing. His words could not be heard through a transparent partition. He twitched briefly, then lay motionless. Lagos, after watching the execution, declared to no one in particular with a handful of reporters present, "It's a hard thing to watch. It's not going to change anything. He's been waiting on this for a while." Johnson was executed not far from where he lived in Atmore, a small community near the Alabama-Florida border, about 50 miles northeast of Mobile. At Johnson's trial, prosecutors presented medical testimony that the baby had numerous injuries and had suffered 3 hard blows to his forehead. The court also heard that the infant was found unresponsive on a couch where Johnson had fallen asleep the day the child died, according to authorities. According to court records, Johnson told Atmore police that he had earlier tried to get the baby to stop crying by placing his hand over Elias's mouth and by sticking his fingers down the child's throat. Johnson spent much of the day Thursday with his brother in a prison visitation area. For a last meal, Johnson requested a turkey bologna sandwich with cheese and french fries. Johnson was the 6th person to be executed in Alabama this year. Christopher Johnson executed Thursday, 20 October 2011. Atmore, Allah. Voila. Christopher Johnson was executed at Holman Prison in Atmore, Allah, on October 20th for the murder of his 6-month-old son, declaring as his only last words, "Game over." He was pronounced dead at 6:25 p.m. local time after receiving a lethal injection. Johnson requested a last meal of a turkey and bologna sandwich with cheese, tomatoes, and french fries that was served to him Thursday afternoon. According to Brian Corbett, Alabama doc spokesperson, prison officials who met with Johnson Thursday said he was upbeat and seemed to be in a good mood. Christopher Johnson spent less than 6 years on death row before his execution Thursday. In comparison to the average, that's a very short amount of time. In September, Derek Mason was executed at Holman Prison after spending 17 years on death row. In June, Jason Williams was executed after 19 years. Johnson only spent 6 years there because he didn't go through the appeals process. For many Alabama death row inmates, their last minutes are spent waiting for word on their final appeal. That was not the case for Johnson. He spent it with his brother Thomas Lagos. Lagos was the only witness to the execution, aside from officials and the press. We talked about the Bible. We talked about his repentance. We talked about the pain and sorrow he's caused family, said Lagos. Since 1977, only 5 death row convictions have been overturned. In the more than 50 other cases, it's ended like it did for Johnson in the execution chamber at Holman Prison. It's the right of the inmate to pursue the appeals process. It's also the reason the average time an inmate is on Alabama death row is just short of 16 years. Johnson represented himself in court and asked the judge for a death sentence for the brutal murder of his 6-month-old son. His wish was granted. He didn't want to live any longer when he lost the most important thing in his life. He had a bad childhood and he finally had something that couldn't walk away and it was gone, said Lagos. To my knowledge, he did not want any appeals. He did not want anyone to represent him, and he wanted to move forward with the process, said Brian Corbett with the Department of Corrections. Johnson filed court papers so that no one would take legal action on his behalf. Alabama executes man for 2005 death of his infant son. OCT 2011, Alabama executed a man on Thursday who asked to be put to death after pleading guilty to fatally suffocating and beating his infant son and had spent just 4 years on death row. Christopher Thomas Johnson, 39, made the rare move of pleading guilty to capital murder in the 2005 death of 6-month-old Elias Ocean Johnson. He requested the death penalty granted in 2007 and waived all appeals. Johnson's last words before being put to death by lethal injection were, "Game over," said Brian Corbett, spokesman for the Alabama Department of Corrections. He was pronounced dead at 6:05 p.m. local time at the Holman Correctional Facility in Atmore after what one law professor said was an unusually short stint on death row and possibly among the shortest on record nationwide. Donald Q. Cochran, a former prosecutor and a Samford University law professor, said the only other case he could recall following such an abrupt timeline was that of confessed Oklahoma City bomber Timothy McVeigh. McVeigh was executed in 2001, 6 years after committing his crime. According to the Death Penalty Information Center, the average time an inmate spends on death row awaiting execution is 14 years, with many waiting longer than 20 years. Johnson was the 6th inmate executed in Alabama this year and the 38th put to death nationwide in 2011. His last meal consisted of a turkey bologna sandwich with cheese and tomatoes, French fries, and an orange drink. No witnesses representing the victim attended the execution, but Corbett said Johnson's brother visited him earlier in the day. Hated his wife. Johnson represented himself at trial. He testified he killed his son because he hated his wife, didn't want to be near her, and didn't want to worry about her threats of putting him in jail for alimony or child support. According to the state attorney general's office, Johnson offered no mitigating circumstances for his crime, and the trial court found the heinous, atrocious, and cruel nature of the murder outweighed any justifications that could have been offered, records show. According to court documents, Johnson tried to quiet Elias while his wife slept. After several unsuccessful attempts in the early morning hours, he laid on top of Elias, covered Elias's mouth with his hand for extended periods of time, and forced his fingers into the child's mouth and down his throat to stop the crying. He also struck the child with his hand. When the child's mother awoke, Elias was unresponsive and cold to the touch. The forensic pathologist who performed Elias's autopsy testified during the trial that the infant suffered at least 85 separate injuries. Suffocation and head trauma were cited as the causes of death. In a statement issued before the execution by Project Hope to abolish the death penalty, Executive Director Esther Brown said, even though the organization respected Johnson's right to have the death penalty imposed, they questioned his motives. We are a prisoner organization and therefore respect a prisoner's wishes. Nevertheless, we question Mr. Johnson's mental stability, which would allow him to make this kind of decision, Brown said. Christopher Thomas Johnson. Christopher Thomas Johnson was sentenced to death for capital murder in the death of his 6-month-old son, Elias Ocean Johnson. Johnson's wife Dana gave birth to their son Elias Ocean Johnson on August 22, 2004. In February 2005, the Johnsons lived in a duplex in Atmore, Alabama. On February 19, 2005, Suzanne Mims and Jason Mims, along with their infant Sophie, arrived at the Johnsons' duplex around 8:30 p.m. to play board games. While playing board games, the Johnsons and the Mims drank alcoholic beverages. At approximately 1:00 a.m., the Mims left. At around 9:00 a.m., Dana woke up and found Johnson and Elias on the couch in the duplex. Dana stated that Elias had bruises on him and that he appeared to be dead. At that point, Dana ran over to feel Elias. Dana testified that Elias felt cool, so she tried to check his pulse. However, she could not find one. Worried about Elias, Dana grabbed the telephone and called emergency 911. Tim Grabill, a paramedic with Atmore Ambulance Service, received a call to go to the Johnsons' duplex. When Grabil and his partner Jareth Hybert arrived at the duplex, Johnson was holding Elias. Grabil observed that Elias was very pale limp and his extremities were cool to the touch. Based on Elias's appearance, Hybert carried him to the ambulance where the paramedics checked his vital signs. At that point, Elias was not breathing and had no heartbeat. Although Grabil believed that Elias was already dead, he performed CPR and rushed Elias to the emergency room at Atmore Hospital. When they arrived at the hospital, Grabil carried Elias into the emergency room, still performing CPR, placed him on a trauma bed, and turned him over to Dr. Stephen Michael Sharp. Dr. Sharp testified that Elias appeared to be dead when he arrived at the hospital. Dr. Sharp described several injuries he observed on Elias's body. Specifically, Dr. Sharp noticed several bruises on Elias's face, a bruise on the bridge of Elias's nose, and ruptured blood vessels around Elias's eyes and chin. Dr. Sharp also noticed a bite mark on one of Elias's arms. Although Elias appeared to be dead, the hospital staff attempted to resuscitate him. Because Elias was unresponsive, Dr. Sharp cleared his airway and placed an endotracheal tube in his throat so that medical personnel could breathe for the child. While attempting to place the endotracheal tube, Dr. Sharp noticed blood in Elias's mouth. Dr. Sharp also testified that Elias had blood in his stomach. After all attempts to resuscitate Elias failed, he was pronounced dead. Investigator Chuck Brooks and Police Chief Jason Dean with the Atmore Police Department went to Atmore Hospital to investigate the circumstances of Elias's death. One of the law enforcement officers asked Johnson and Dana to come to the police station and give statements relating to the death of their child. Dana rode to the police station with a member of her church, and Johnson rode to the police station with Chief Dean. During the ride to the police station, Johnson spontaneously stated that he had something to do with Elias's death. Once at the police station, Johnson gave a statement to Investigator Brooks and Irene Johnson, a social worker with the Alabama Department of Human Resources. After being informed of and waiving his Miranda rights, Johnson indicated that Elias had been crying, so Johnson laid on top of him to try to quiet the child. When Elias did not stop crying, Johnson stuck his fingers in the child's mouth and hit him. Johnson stated that last night was the hardest that he ever hit Elias, and he was pretty sure Elias's death was his fault. Johnson also stated that after the event that night, he did not think that he had seriously injured Elias. Dr. Kathleen Entis, a medical examiner who was formerly with the Alabama Department of Forensic Sciences, performed the autopsy on Elias and testified that it would be reasonable to estimate that Elias had suffered 85 separate injuries, including a bite mark on his arm. Dr. Entis testified that Elias had multiple bruises on his face and head. She stated that both of Elias's ears were swollen and bruised, which was consistent with a boxing blow and squeezing. Dr. Entis testified that Elias's lower lip was swollen and bloody from a blunt force injury. Dr. Entis explained that Elias had 3 impact injuries to his forehead. She informed the jury that Elias's ethmoid bone, which is in the sinuses, was broken and that Elias's sinuses were full of blood. Dr. Entis testified that Elias had deep contusions on his head and that his brain had hemorrhaged as a result of blunt force trauma. Dr. Entis also testified that Elias had hemorrhages in both eyes and had injuries to his inner lips and nose that indicated that he had been smothered by the forceful covering sealing off of his mouth and nose. According to Dr. Entis, Elias's injuries had been inflicted within 24 hours of his death. Dr. Entis finally testified that in her opinion, Elias died as a result of blunt force trauma and smothering. In addition to the state's evidence, Johnson testified that he intentionally murdered his son because he hated his wife. Johnson explained that he would have left his wife long before the murder if it had not been for Elias. According to Johnson, he did not want to worry about her threats of putting me in jail for alimony or child support, so he intentionally inflicted wounds on Elias that caused Elias's life to expire. Johnson stated that his final words to Elias were, "You go see Jesus." Johnson's ex-wife Dana said that she welcomes Christopher's death. Although I normally do not agree with capital punishment, I will not lose any sleep over this particular execution. Whether it is right or wrong, I feel that a weight will be lifted from my soul on Thursday, and finally, I will feel relief. I am scarred by this, and Christopher took away my son, my trust in other people, and even my desire to ever have another child. I still have a hard time being around children because of the sorrow it makes me feel. Every day I see children that are Elias's age, and I wonder what he would have been like. She has since moved away and is studying to become a nurse. My son was the most delightful, calm little boy I have ever known. Christopher Johnson took him from me. I have spent years trying to heal from this unimaginable pain, she said. Exclusive baby killer set to be executed, baby's mom speaks out. October 17, 2011. Exclusive. A convicted Atmore baby killer is set to be executed Thursday, and the mother of the baby is speaking out for the first time about the murder of her 6-month-old son and the death penalty to be carried out against her husband. Christopher Thomas Johnson is scheduled to be put to death at 6 p.m. Thursday at Holman Prison in Atmore. He testified that he purposefully beat his son Elias Ocean Johnson to death on February 20, 2005, because he hated his wife Dana Johnson. Thursday, I will be granted closure, finally, Dana Johnson told NorthEscambia.com in an exclusive interview. Although I normally do not agree with capital punishment, I will not lose any sleep over this particular execution. Whether it is right or wrong, I feel that a weight will be lifted from my soul on Thursday. And finally, I will feel relief. You go see Jesus, were the last words Christopher Johnson said to his son. He testified at his trial before beating him to death. Those words have unimaginably haunted Dana Johnson for over 6 years. She's rarely spoken about the murder and is sharing photos of Elias for the first time ever in this story. My son was the most delightful, calm little boy I have ever known. Christopher Johnson took him from me. I have spent years trying to heal from this unimaginable pain, Dana Johnson said. I am scarred by this, and Christopher took away my son, my trust in other people, and even my desire to ever have another child. I still have a hard time being around children because of the sorrow it makes me feel. Every day I see children that are Elias's age, and I wonder what he would have been like. Dana Johnson won't be able to attend Thursday's execution. She now lives far from Atmore in the western United States, where she is studying to become a nurse. I can tell you one thing, Thursday will be a day of closure for me, whether that is wrong or right. I curse the day that I met that man, Dana Johnson said, adding that she feels sorry that Atmore is associated with this heinous crime. I am sorry that the people of Atmore, myself and my son, had to be subjected to this horrible crime. The people of Atmore were some of the kindest and most welcoming people I have ever met, she said. Christopher Johnson fired his public defenders and served as his own attorney during his 2006 Escambia County trial, telling the judge and jury that he wanted the death penalty for his actions. It took the jury less than a half hour to return a guilty verdict, and the death penalty was imposed. The death sentence has been upheld by the Alabama Court of Criminal Appeals, and Christopher Johnson has to date declined additional appeals. On October 20, 2011, at Holman Prison in Atmore, Alabama, Christopher Johnson was executed by lethal injection. He had spent barely 6 years on death row, a rare speed for capital punishment cases. As the drugs began to flow, Johnson's final words were simple. Game over. He never apologized. He never mentioned his son. Elias's mother, Dana Johnson, who had pleaded for her child's life 6 years earlier, said she prayed for peace, not for Johnson, but for her baby boy. In the end, the state of Alabama closed one of its darkest cases, a story of hate disguised as love, and a man who believed killing his child was revenge. Justice at last was served, but no execution could ever undo what happened that morning in 2000, because some evils aren't born, they're chosen.